The Mafia boss's mistress showed up at the front gate, but the sick truth was actually far more deadly. When Julia confronted her husband Matteo about the beautiful woman claiming to be his Hulhuller, he coldly told her not to worry about it. So, she left him. But months later, heavily pregnant and hiding out, Julia discovers that mistress wasn't a lover at all. She was a mole feeding layout intel to a rival cartel, and now that same cartel is coming directly for Julia's unborn baby. Let us step into this scene together, you and I, observing from the shadows of this cold Milan office. The lighting is harsh, designed for bitter endings. At the mahogany table sits a lawyer, perspiration soaking through his collar, gripping a silver pen as if it could save his life. He is drowning in fear, and he should be. Over by the glass stands Matteo Rinaldi. Notice how the camera lingers on his stillness. Men of his violent pedigree never fidget. They use dead silence to suffocate the room. His back remains turned, hands neatly clasped, allowing the gang ink crawling up his thick neck to project pure menace. The lesson here is written in blood. Never mistake a predator's absolute quiet for peace. They are simply calculating the angle of the kill. The heavy letters scarred across his knuckles. A tragic story of childhood trauma buried beneath decades of calculated cruelty. The camera holds on him. He remains completely frozen for 11 agonizing minutes. Then the heavy oak door clicks open. Watch his shoulders drop. We are looking at a ruthless mob boss who sleeps soundly after ordering executions. But the second Julia steps into the frame, his nervous system shatters. She drifts across the carpet with a haunting, tragic grace, wearing a heavy camel coat draped over a delicate ivory dress. His face is an ice-cold mask of composure. But do not let the calm fool you. Look closely, at the tension in her jaw. The laws, the quasitous people in the room are always the ones carrying the heaviest, most desperate survival instincts. Watch her eyes in this tight close-up. She completely refuses to look at him, moving with slow deliberation to set her bag down. She smooths her coat, a desperate micro-movement to ground her violently trembling hands. When she finally lifts her chin into the light, the visual impact hits us like a physical blow. She is 7 months pregnant. That ivory fabric clings to a heavy secret she had somehow kept from a paranoid, controlling syndicate leader for nearly a year. Imagine the suffocating terror of hiding new life from a man who dictates death. Matteo finally turns from the window. You can almost hear his sick obsession with dominance shatter as his dark eyes drop to her stomach. You truly never understand how violently a bond breaks until you study how the trap was built. Let us dissolve the scene and jump back 18 months. Julia had no suspicion she was walking blindly into a beautifully disguised nightmare. The setting is a high society masquerade in Florence. An ocean of absurd wealth masking rotten souls. She is nobody here, hiding in a borrowed blue dress, gripping a champagne flute to block out the aristocratic sneers. She retreats to a shadowed corner, pretending to study an oil painting. Suddenly, without a breath of warning, he is standing inches from her shoulder. Monsters like him do not make a sound when they stalk their prey. They wait until they have already breached your defenses. The lesson is vital. Always trust your instincts when the hair on your neck rises because someone stepped too close in the dark. A man standing 6 feet and 3 inches tall, built like a wall, should not be able to sneak up on a shadow. He looks like a bare-knuckle brawler, violently forced into a custom Italian suit. Yet, he wears those faded prison tattoos like medals of honor. That blatant disrespect for the room is pure arrogance. He leans close, his voice a low rumble, whispering that she is staring at the wrong painting. Julia attempts to hold her ground. She refuses to give him her profile, fighting for a scrap of power. She murmurs that another canvas across the room holds more honest grief. Then she makes the ultimate, tragic mistake. She turns and looks him directly in the eyes. His gaze is completely hollow, a freezing, pitch-black void under the warm chandelier light. Staring into those eyes is like peering down into a freezing well. It is not overt aggression, which makes it far more terrifying. It is a vast, empty hunger. He introduces himself as Matteo, extending a massive hand stained with gang ink. Against every single alarm bell, screaming in her mind, she takes his hand and softly offers her name. His reaction sensation? A slow, knowing smile as he whispers that he already knew exactly who she was. That is the chilling opening move of a practiced stalker. He launches an intense, suffocating pursuit, claiming her space as if he already owns her soul. He masks his obsession with grand cinematic romance, buying out her favorite cafe, drowning her apartment in roses. Remember, the most dangerous cages are painted to look like pure love. Listen closely, because you and I are going to dissect exactly how this toxic emotional snare closes. Matteo executes the oldest trick in the Predator's playbook. He makes her feel like the center of the universe. Giulia is not foolish. Growing up in Milan, she knows his family controls the underworld. Yet, this man does not behave like a monster with her. He is intensely focused, asking deep, probing questions. But here is the cinematic tragedy. To him, this intimacy is merely data collection. He is patiently mapping her vulnerabilities to bind her to him. The life lesson is terrifying. True manipulation always feels exactly like a fairy tale at first. She falls in love just like falling asleep, slowly, then all at once. Fast forward 8 months, and the golden handcuffs snap shut. They marry at his isolated private estate. The camera contrasts her glowing white dress with his sharp black suit, making him look like the Grim Reaper collecting a soul. He even produces a single fake tear at the altar, an absolute masterclass in acting to seal her blind loyalty. For 4 months, she floats in a heavily guarded honeymoon illusion. Then, the velvet rots, dinners cancelled without a word, a ringing phone that drains the color from the room, a locked study door she is forbidden to touch. Ruthless men, she knows. The lesson is cruel, knowing you are trapped in a nightmare. And finding the courage to run are two completely different things. The night the beautiful lie burns is a dead, quiet Wednesday in October. Giulia sits awake in the pitch-black kitchen. A window is cracked open, just enough to let the chill and Matteo's voice drift inside. He speaks in that hollow, bone-chilling register men of violence use when ordering a life erased. He murmurs to handle it and make sure nothing is found. She will never know whose blood watered the garden that night. Instead, her fragile mind retreats into denial. She forces herself to believe he was discussing a corporate merger. For 6 agonizing weeks, she lies to her own reflection just to survive the mornings. But the lesson remains absolute. You can never outrun. The illusion shatters completely when a strange woman violently rattles the front gates. Focus on this venomous visitor. Dripping in aggressive luxury, she demands an audience with Matteo, carrying a dark swagger that proves she belongs in his blood-soaked world. Giulia approaches the iron gate. The woman slowly rakes her eyes over Giulia, from her plain cardigan down to her diamond wedding band, and smiles a smile he engineered to crush you into himself. She laughs, calling Giulia a pathetic, temporary placeholder. It is a fatal wound. Giulia stumbles back into the kitchen, gasping for air for 40 minutes, as if the room is filling with water. When Matteo returns and she confronts, He executes the ultimate toxic maneuver. He offers zero denial. He just stares with those dead eyes and calls it complicated. The lesson? A vague excuse is always the absolute loudest confession of guilt. He brushes her devastation aside as ancient history, coldly instructing her to stop overreacting. But listen closely, because what he fails to say is what finally snaps the psychological chains. He never promises the affair is over. He refuses to say he loves her. That chilling dismissal turns her into a ghost. On a freezing Sunday in January, she strikes. She planned this escape for 2 weeks' precision with the cold precision of an assassin. There are no screaming matches, no tearful begging for closure. She knows if she stops to cry, those tears will freeze into iron shackles. She packs one small suitcase. She leaves the heavy diamond ring resting on the granite counter, trading a fortune for a tiny slip of paper. The lesson is undeniable. Sometimes absolute silence is the most devastating escape plan. You and I must look at that's a letter. It contains no burning rage, just the freezing facts of a tragedy. Her elegant script reads, "I cannot be the person you need me to be in the life you've chosen. Goodbye." With one swift cut, she severs the rotten artery. But the agonizing irony of this film is she walked away completely blind to her own condition. 3 weeks later, a smiling nurse delivers the news, and Julia freezes in paralyzing horror. This is the climax where two hearts shatter simultaneously. Matteo found his light, but let his darkness suffocate it, while Julia escaped the monster only to carry his bloodline. The final lesson is sometimes saving your own soul, stepping into the terrifying isolation. True freedom often demands a violently heavy price. Let us focus the lens on Julia, a woman chess while her adversary plays with fire. She calculates every shadow, anticipating the tragedy. Concealing an unborn child from a criminal patriarch was not malice. It was the raw instinct of a mother fighting to survive. She needed his ink on those divorce papers merely to breathe. Many use children as pawns in the bitter theater of heartbreak, but she refuses that grim tactic. Trapping him would only forge a new cell in the same prison. Instead, she flees to a sun-drenched room in Turin, pouring her soul into her art just to keep the darkness at bay. It reveals a quiet, enduring truth. The most intelligent choice you can make is laying down your own solid foundation for letting another soul walk across it. Picture the opening shot of this beautiful, irreversible tragedy. We find Julia, 5 months along, moving like a grandmaster through a room of amateurs. She spent 6 months forging a life of solid steel, flanked by a divorce attorney whose blood runs like glacier water. For half a year, Matteo, her underworld husband, brushed off the separation as a mere phantom. Now the lens captures him rooted by the window. The harsh daylight catches his knuckles turning bone white against the heavy mahogany desk. He is a tyrant, suddenly realizing the iron chains have shattered. It is a quiet portrait of shifting power. True freedom always demands hacking away at the invisible ropes, binding you to your captors, even when your own hands bleed from gripping the blade. You can practically feel the oxygen bleeding out of the scene. Matteo locks onto her in the dim light, tracking her breath like a wounded wolf, deciding where to strike. Yet Julia remains carved from stone. She smooths the fabric of her coat, freezing him out, and instructs the lawyer to begin. Matteo offers no furious outburst. He does not shatter glass or upend the table. He weaponizes the stillness, choking the life out of the room merely by inhabiting it. In the background shadows, his enforcer Enzo shifts uncomfortably, caught between blood loyalty and heavy guilt. We must remember this tragic reality about facing a predator. Silence is never empty space. When the person holding the weapon goes entirely quiet, they are simply taking aim. Watch the micro expressions on Enzo standing in the shadows. Once he was the lone soul in this violent empire who treated Julia with a shred of humanity. Now, the camera catches his eyes dropping to her softly rounded stomach, the devastating math playing out on his face. Suddenly, the rookie editor Enichini shatters the tension, barking a foolish demand at the syndicate boss about the child. The lighting seems to darken as Matteo drops his voice to a rasped whisper. A scream in this underworld denotes anger, but a whisper signals the measuring of a coffin. The lawyer keeps pushing, tragically blind to the explosive was where he just tripped. Let this be a grim lesson in survival. When you find yourselves standing before a starving lion, demanding immediate answers will only make you the prey. Notice the subtle physiological warfare in this frame. Julie conceals the wild hammering of her heart behind a mask of absolute porcelain. She glides her gaze right past her terrifying husband and coldly declares the child is beyond his reach. Matteo recoils, his heavy voice dropping her name like an iron anvil against the desk. As Julia directs her counsel to move forward, a wretched, suffocated gasp escapes the patriarch. It is the agonizing sound of a tyrant physically choking on his own sudden impotence. He sinks into his leather chair, a portrait of dark, murderous gravity collapsing under its own weight. It is a miserable but necessary truth to absorb. Those who grew accustomed to ruling your spirit will always treat a simple, healthy boundary as an act of absolute treason. Matteo flattens his voice into a dead, chilling frequency, the exact cue heard right before violence starts. He calculates the bitter math aloud, accusing her of hiding the unborn heir the very day she fled. Julia refuses his theatrical despair. She meets his hollow eyes and quietly states she only discovered the life inside her after escaping. The atmosphere grows so suffocating you could slice it with a blade. The polished attorney suddenly fixates on his trembling pen, while Enzo turns into a breathing statue. The fallen king loops the timeline obsessively, entirely unable to accept his own defeat. It is a tragic but ironclad lesson to carry with you. You will slowly lose your own sanity, trying to reason with a mind deeply in love with its own comforting fictions. You and I must linger on this frame, for this is the exact second Julia shatters her chains. She looks into the dark eyes of the phantom who once possessed her, calmly declaring she needed time to weigh if he even deserved to know his child. For a fleeting beat, the iron-willed criminal cracks. His deep voice splinters before he wrestles it back into the dark. She gazes upon the ruthless killer she once bled to save, entirely erasing his massive ego from the narrative. She speaks only of the child's needs, rendering Matteo's demands invisible. It is a profound cinematic awakening. True healing never begins when you finally fix the soul who broke you. It begins the moment you stop trying to save the roaring fire and simply start pulling the innocent out of the flames. The silence stretches as Matteo swallows his defeat. He rises, blotting out the light, and orders the lawyers out of the chamber. When the rookie hesitates, Matteo drops the room into absolute frost. Leave immediately. Julia offers her counsel a slight nod, and instantly her human shields vanish. Only Enzo remains in the shadows, yet Julia does not flinch. She presses her palms against the cool mahogany, staring down the dark shadow of her ex-husband reflected in the window. He whispers to the glass, asking if the blood is his. She answers with an unshakable confirmation. It is a terrifying cinematic climax, carrying an undeniable truth. Sometimes, the only way to conquer the monster in the dark is to firmly hold your ground and stare directly into its hollow eyes. The reaction is sudden. like a gunshot. Matteo spins, violently tearing the dead air apart, crossing the floor in 4 strides until his shadow swallows her entirely. It is a primitive intimidation tactic designed to force a flinch. But the camera reveals his shattered posture. He stands like a marble statue, yet his eyes are hollow, sunken deep into exhausted pits. The dark ink winding up his throat highlights his sickly pallor. Here stands an emperor who demands to rule the earth, yet the loss of one woman is actively rotting his soul from the marrow out. It is a visually striking lesson on the illusion of power. Absolute control is merely a ghost. If you grip the world too fiercely, your own bones are the very first things destined to shatter. For an agonizing frame, the ghost of Julia's old devotion return. She observes the physical decay of then before her, and a tragic ripple of pity crosses her face. But the illusion breaks. She knows his grief does not stem from a broken heart. He is merely mourning the loss of a prized possession. He whispers about the unborn son, his voice fracturing as he swears he would have stood by her. A trembling hand reaches out, suspended in the cold air, incapable of crossing the ruins he built. She stares at his hovering fingers, acknowledging his words with quiet sorrow. It is the most perilous trap in human nature. Just because a wounded wolf weeps in the freezing snow does not mean it will hesitate to tear you to pieces when the deep hunger returns. Let us take a closer look at this defensive strike. She gazes into his eyes and states that his suffocating tyranny is the exact reason she buried the truth. By the door, Enzo turns his face away, unable to watch his untouchable king get dismantled by a pregnant mother. Slowly, Matteo retracts his hand. The camera lingers as he swallows a volcanic surge of venom, utilizing the terrifying discipline of a hardened boss. In a heartbeat, the wounded lover vanishes, replaced by the chilling interrogator. He names Turin as her sanctuary, a fact pulled from his dark network. Julia does not flinch at the stalking. Real peace is never about discovering a place where shadows cannot stretch. It is about learning to walk through the dark without letting the monsters break your stride. Julia attempts to weave a thread of normalcy as discussing her new life as if this were a routine dispute. Matteo vaporizes that illusion in a breath. He informs her, without a trace of warmth, that Turin is off the table. The lighting feels colder as he delivers the mandate, devoid of rage, dripping only with the finality of an emperor declaring law. He will never permit his heir to draw breath outside his domain. Legal documents mean nothing to a man who exists above the law. In his twisted reality, he is simply recollecting a stolen asset. It is a nauseating realization, yet a crucial lesson in navigating darkness. Extreme toxicity never views you as a human counterpart at a negotiation table. They view you merely as a misplaced possession destined to be dragged back into the cage. We must pause the frame on this devastating turn. Matteo points his defiance like a loaded revolver. Pressing his hands against the mahogany desk, he outright denies her his signature. Then he deploys a psychological grenade, murmuring a dark invitation for her to come home. The line is purposed to resurrect her old traumatic bonds. Yet Julia sees through the poison. She holds the predator to SS gaze and firmly denies him. When he feigns angel jealous, insisting it was merely a question, she shatters the facade. "You are not asking," she states softly. "You are instructing." It is a masterclass in survival, leaving us with a haunting truth. The most dangerous form of control rarely resembles a prison cell. Sometimes, the cruelest cage you will ever step into is perfectly disguised as a lover's warm embrace. Look closely at the framing in this shot. The shadows seem to press inward as Julia finally names the ghost between them, that fateful garden conversation where The bloodstains of his empire seeped into their marriage. Matteo shifts his weight, his voice smooth, weaving his usual web of denial. But she severs the thread. Heavy with child, she pushes herself up, her trembling hand resting on the wood. "Take the offer," she commands. Yet as she turns, he steps into the doorway. He becomes a wall of tailored suits and silent authority, blocking her only exit. The life lesson here is absolute. You can never wait for the architect of your prison to kindly hand you the keys. True freedom demands you brace your shaking legs and walk right out the door. You and I need to examine Matteo's gravity in this frame. Notice the rigid line of his shoulders as he positions himself between his wife and the hallway. He leaves a physical gap, yet his presence pulls every ounce of oxygen from the room.
"You look exhausted," he murmurs.
The lighting catching a dangerous softening in his eyes as he weaponizes affection. Julia is his signature rage, but instead he drowns her in manufactured empathy. Her jaw clenches, locking her face into a mask of pure survival. "Let me take you to lunch," he breathes, dropping the invitation like a heavy anchor. The tragedy here carries a brutal life lesson. When a man holding all the power invites you to sit at his table, it is never a polite request. It is an inescapable command. The camera lingers on his hands. Look at the dark ink on his knuckles, shifting as he grips the wood with terrifying, restrained violence. His gaze sweeps over her, cataloging every vulnerability. "You need to eat," he dictates, leaving zero room for debate. She lifts her chin, her voice trembling but defiant, warning him that food will not change her mind. And then Matteo drops the floor out from under her. "I know," he whispers. "Understand this tragic truth. When a predator admits defeat, he is not waving a white flag. He is merely repositioning his weapons." Julia exhales, her iron defenses as he slipping just a fraction, granting him one single hour. "Just us," he purrs smoothly, no backup. The life alert is written in her quiet surrender. Never sacrifice a single hour of your future to someone who has already devoured the best years of your past. The tragedy of Julia is that she fully sees the snare. She knows isolation is the beating heart of a trauma bond. Those two words, "just us," are a siren song of danger. Yet the gravitational pull of their ruined love drags her into the dark. The director frames them in a dimly lit, secluded restaurant, shielding his empire from prying eyes. Watch how he orchestrates the scene, claiming the corner booth and ordering still water for her without a glance at the menu. He perfectly recalls her prenatal aversions. To an outsider, he is a fiercely devoted husband. But the camera knows it is a chilling display of dominance, proving she remains under his watchful eye. The life lesson here cuts deep. Genuine love will always offer you a choice. Control makes every decision for you, expecting you to smile gracefully from inside your beautifully locked cage. Let's take a closer look at Matteo's terrifying duality. His mind operates like a cold filing cabinet, retaining every tiny preference his wife ever possessed. In the golden days, this obsessive focus masqueraded as breathtaking romance. Now it reveals itself as inescapable surveillance. He asks about the baby, his tone clinical, extracting biological intel. "Normal," she replies, refusing to bleed for him. Then, without a word, he places a piece of bread on her porcelain plate. It is a hauntingly domestic-ass action born from years of deep conditioning. The phantom limb of their dead marriage is still twitching on the table. She feels the violation but swallows her words. The silence holds a painful life lesson. Sometimes, the ghosts of our comfortable, old habits are far harder to outrun than the actual monsters we finally manage to leave behind. The cinematography is grim as he interrogates her new life in Turin. The dim lighting catches the harsh ink, sprawling up his neck, even draped in expensive wool. He radiates the low-frequency hum of pure violence. He is a starving wolf sitting patiently at the table. As the camera pushes in on Julia, we witness a tragic internal collapse. Her eyes glisten because, heaven help her, she has missed him every single day. This is the tragedy of a trauma bond, her nervous system screaming for the hands that shattered it. But she digs her nails into her palms, anchoring her reality. She recognizes the physical ache as a mere chemical withdrawal. The life lesson here is profound. Missing the person who broke you does not mean you made a mistake by walking away. It simply means your heart is surviving the terrible withdrawal and finally starting to heal. You and I can see the tectonic plates shifting in this exact moment. Mateo quietly demands to be in the room their child is born, while weaponizing the boundaries she desperately built. Watch his micro-expressions here, a cinematic masterclass in psychological warship. The cold armor melts away, replaced by the bleeding vulnerability of a desperate father. It is genuinely terrifying to watch. A true predator knows precisely when to let a single authentic tear fall to inflict maximum emotional damage. Julie E's breath catches. She sees the phantom of the man she once loved, and it completely paralyzes her logic. She looks away, unable to merge this weeping father with the monster in her memories. The life lesson here is vital for survival. A single moment of genuine, tearful pain from a toxic person does not magically wash away the years of wreckage they left behind. The camera shows the city outside the glass, blind to the psychological bloodbath at this corner table. I will think about it, Julia whispers. He nods, a brilliantly executed performance of restraint. A suffocating silence settles over the tablecloth. In this cinematic pause, you can almost see the dangerous golden illusion wrapping its arms around her. Her bruised heart begs to buy into the fantasy, to pretend this man is just a misunderstood husband. But survival requires constant vigilance. We see her knuckles turn white as she grips the wood, brick by brick rebuilding her shattered walls. She leans forward, staring straight into the dark abyss of his eyes. "There is something you should know," she murmurs. The life lesson rings loud and clear. When the silence starts feeling a little too comfortable with a monster, you must find the courage to finally make some noise. We now watch the futility of explaining emotional starvation to Katrovishny, to megalomanies as she confesses Nenio's escape was never just about the blood in the garden. It was the suffocating pressure of living inside his twisted mind. She articulates the tragedy of loving a man who worships only his own shadow. "I felt like a room in your house," she whispers, beautifully decorated, but permanently locked behind a heavy door. It is the haunting definition of a trophy wife. She drives the dry truth deeper, explaining that his burning need to protect her is indistinguishable from his need to imprison her. For him, love and total domination are exact synonyms. Mateo turns to stone, the muscles in his arms locking up against the table. The life lesson is etched into this devastation. A golden cage is still a prison, no matter how obsessively they polish the bars. The dark ink on his skin pulls taut as the brutal weight of her words lands. Then, the scene delivers a psychological earthquake. "You are right," he murmurs into the shadows. He repeats it, the syllables tasting like ash. He stares at his hands, confessing the tragic flaw of his existence. He cannot distinguish between emotional intimacy and a tactical defense strategy. "I handled you," he admits softly. Let that sterile, terrifying word echo for a moment. Handled. He finally applies the cold vocabulary of his underworld to the woman he loves. He never saw a human wife. He saw a beautiful, volatile liability requiring constant risk management. The heavy silence that fills the room is the sound of his grand delusion shattering into pieces. We are left with a chilling life lesson. You can never build a warm home with a man whose only skill is constructing military fortresses. Stick with me here, because the fragile architecture of his justification is about to collapse. She watches him, asking what triggered this sudden self-awareness. He gestures toward her swollen belly. The camera catches the dark circles, eyes under his eyes, as he admits he deployed operatives to track her every breath. "You were having me stalked," she states, stripping away his romantic veneer. He leans in, desperately clinging to the sick delusion that obsessive surveillance is devotion. "There is a distinction," he begs, his voice breaking. "There really is not," she replies, her gaze like absolute ice.
The first time the Mafia prince does not fight back. "I know," he whispers, finally drowning in his own sickness. The lesson is terrifyingly clear.
If a man has to spy on your shadow to feel secure, he does not love you. He simply wants to own you. Let's hit pause right here and study Julia S.'s desperate escape. Cut to 2 days later, she bolts back to Turin, plunging her legal team into the dark. Picture the haunting cinematography on that train. She sits by the window, trembling arms around her stomach, whisperings promise to a child that hasn't either draws even a breath. Trauma survivors know this physical response. You cling to the nearest anchor. "He is never what I expect," she murmurs to her reflection in the glass. That sentence is the absolute snare. Unpredictability is the superglue of a toxic bond, hooking your brain on the adrenaline of the unknown. Finally, she reaches the sunlit sanctuary of her friend Severina, a warm contrast to Matteo S.'s cold underworld. It leaves us with a beautiful truth. Sometimes the strongest armor you can wear against a nightmare is the open door of one genuinely good friend. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? The opens on Serena. She doesn't flinch, doesn't play games. The second Julia crosses the threshold, Serena demands the unvarnished truth. Julia S. shoulders slump as she confesses the impossible. Matteo is acting entirely out of character. The mob boss actually delivered a genuine apology instead of his usual venomous blame. That kind of emotional whiplash will completely shatter a person's peace. Serena sits in stone-cold silence as Julia drops the final weight. Matteo confessed he treated her like a mere transaction. You and I must recognize the tragic irony right here. When the very monster who broke your spirit suddenly adopts the soft language of healing, he is usually just slipping on a far more dangerous mask. The hard truth of our existence is simple. An apology comes without a change in behavior, just manipulation tailored in an expensive suit. Serena goes dead silent. In a room this heavy, that quiet speaks louder than a scream. She tilts her head, asking the one question that cuts to the bone. Does Julia actually believe his act? Julia answers with a hollow voice, dissecting his motives like a cold science experiment. She thinks he genuinely believes his own lies in this moment, but self-deception does not mend a ruined soul. Serena brutally turns the mirror back toward her friend. It is never about whether the villain can find redemption, but whether you are willing to burn in his fire while he tries. 3 agonizing days bleed by in the dim apartment. Then the illusions of safety shatters. A nameless number flashes on her phone screen. Her trauma-wired brain instantly smells the smoke. She answers. Then a slick, strange voice slithers through the speaker. It is a sobering lesson we all face eventually. You can run as far as your legs will carry you, but until you sever the tie completely, your dark past will always hunt down your new address. Pay close attention to how a true predator strikes. The man on the other end knows exactly how to use fear, casually slipping the Mafia name. She sacrificed everything to escape into the air. Watch how Julia's knuckles turn a desperate white, her chest heaving as panic hammers against her ribs. "Who is this?" she demands, her voice trembling. The stranger just purrs, playing the role of her husband's polite friend, looking for a casual talk. The second she rejects him, the velvet gloves come off. He coldly reminds her that the innocent child growing inside her carries the Rinaldi blood, turning her baby into an incredibly valuable piece on the board. The blood in her veins turns to frost. She orders him away and slams the phone down. But you and I both know the tragic reality of this scene. Pretending the wolf is gone will never save you. The hardest lesson of human nature is that ignoring our deepest, darkest problems only gives them time to sharpen their teeth in the shadows. She sits in the dim room for 30 long seconds, entirely paralyzed by the shock. Then, acting on the tragic instinct of a battered survivor, she dials the very monster she bled to escape. Matteo answers on the first ring, a low, heavy shadow. "I have been waiting for you," he breathes into the receiver. When she chokes out the details of the threat, the line goes dead. It isn't a peaceful silence, but the bone-chilling pause of an apex predator locking onto a scent. He demands answers. She describes the stranger, the rough southern drawl. The ensuing quiet is thick, suffocating, entirely devoid of mercy. When Matteo finally speaks her name, the wounded husband facade evaporates. Out steps the ruthless kingpin, the sovereign of violence she once heard ordering deaths in the dead of night. It serves as a grim warning to us all. You can dress a man in apologies and soft words, but when real danger strikes, his truest, most violent nature will always tear through the disguise. His tone is pure, unforgiving iron now, demanding her absolute surrender. He counters her to return to Milan this instant. When she pushes back, watch the masterclass in psychological warfare unfold. He instantly shifts into the protective hero, shielding her from the wolves. "If they have your private number," he warns softly, "your sanctuary is already compromised." A visceral panic sets in. Her trembling hand falls to shield her swollen belly. "Who are these men?" she pleads. His hesitation in that moment is truly terrifying. He confesses they are rivals hunting for leverage, forces he has failed to suppress for months. This scene lays as bare a devastating flaw. Powerful men. They will raise absolute ruins before admitting they have lost their grip on the wheel. We must realize that control is merely a fragile illusion. Fighting desperately to maintain it almost always ends up destroying the very souls we claim to cherish. Stick with me here, because a manipulator only offers the truth when it serves as a weapon. Julia asks if this is the kind of bloody chaos he handles in the shadows. For the first time, he doesn't deflect. He swears an end to the lies and begs her to return. Right on cue, the child kicks inside her, as if feeling the massive gravity of her surrender. She breaks. The very next morning, a sleek black sedan glides to the curb. Matteo didn't send muscle. He sent Enzo, his most lethal and trusted shadow. Enzo steps out offering fresh coffee and an aura of complete, unnerving calm. This is precisely how the cage locks. Enzo acts as the gentle face of a nightmare, wrapping insane mafia violence in a blanket of normalcy. The lesson here will chill your blood. The most dangerous threats in this world rarely come screaming. More often, they are quietly pouring you a warm cup of coffee while the entire house burns down around your feet. Look closely at Serena, the loyal anchor, who packs her bags without a second thought. Enzo doesn't offer a single word of protest, a detail that perfectly exposes the sheer desperation bleeding out of Matteo. The long ride toward Milan is suffocated by silence. Serena drifts off, but Enzo drives with the rigid focus of a soldier escorting a nuclear core through hostile territory. Julia stares through the tinted glass, utterly numb. Then Enzo's soft voice pierces the quiet, dropping the heavy detail that Matteo stayed up until 4 in the morning, personally securing the perimeter for her arrival. "You don't need to tell me that," she snaps, her voice brittle. But the seed is planted. The faithful lieutenant chips away at her armor, feeding her the illusion of the monster's devotion. It is a tragic reality we all must face. We constantly mistake toxic obsession for genuine love, the heavy chains to lock ourselves back to the hands that broke us. We need to unpack this carefully, as this quiet car ride is pure psychological warfare. "I am telling you anyway," Enzo pushes, his voice smooth as glass. In a flash of cold clarity, Julia puts it together.
Matteo had Enzo stalking her in turn from the very beginning. Enzo effortlessly spins the revelation, swearing he was only a shield in the dark.
It is the exact same twisted rationale his master employs, yet coming from the polite killer, her anger struggles to hold the line. He gently asks about her unborn child, and she confesses her desperate need for true safety.
Enzo actually validates her fear, admitting Fineo is a difficult man to believe. He swears that in 16 years,
he has never witnessed his boss drowning in such agonizing guilt. This reveals how desperately humanity craves validation. When an enemy acknowledges our pain, our walls crumble. But never forget this vital truth. Acknowledging your bleeding does not mean they will drop the knife. A typical manipulator offers a hollow apology just before blaming you for the damage, but Matteo appears to be genuinely drowning in the wreckage of his choices. Julia forces her face to remain a blank mask, though her fingers drill to guard her unborn child. They finally roll a stop at the sprawling estate. This fortress is essentially Matteo's dark, controlling mind constructed from mortar and stone, imposing iron gates, freezing shadows, and sharp gardens that demand submission. She expected this place to feel violently foreign after 6 months of freedom. Yet, the instant the scent of polished stone and ancient wood hits his lungs, her erratic heartbeat dangerously slows. It is a sickening wave of comfort. This is the Greek tragedy of returning to a broken bond. When you survive in the dark for years, stepping back into the shadows feels like stepping into an embrace. We make the fatal error of confusing a familiar cage with true safety. Instead of rushing to the courtyard, Matteo lingers deep in the gloom of the grand foyer. The boss cannot appear desperate. That requires surrendering dominance. He waits by the sweeping staircase, his sleeves rolled back to reveal the dark ink of his violent life. His heavy gaze locks to her pale face, then drops like a stone to the curve of her pregnancy. For a fleeting, agonizing second, a look of absolute, terrifying ownership flashes across his features before he buries it. "Thank you for coming," he murmurs, when his tone flawless. "I didn't return for you," she fires back, frantically stacking bricks for a wall. "I came for my child. Our child," he corrects in a veiled whisper, effortlessly stripping the weapon from her hands. He mentions setting up the east bedroom, surgically avoiding the word yours. It is a quiet, devastating masterstroke. A brilliant predator always knows exactly how much leash to feed you, granting the beautiful illusion that you are running free. "You remembered I prefer the eastern light," she points out, her voice barely a breath. "I remember everything," he replies, his delivery completely dead and flat. "You and I must see the trap hiding here." Weaponizes tiny TD takes the victim feel profoundly seen, swaddling them in a warm, counterfeit sense of worth. Later, a silent dinner is averred, meticulously catered to her delicate condition. When the plates are cleared, he simply asks her to walk with him. A gentle request, not a mob star's command. It hands us the sweet, ghost intoxicating illusion of choice. They drift into the shadowy garden, skeletal branches scraping the sky above them. He maintains a respectful distance, no shedding his brutal dominance like an old skin. It is a brilliant, terrifying evolution of his control. Tell me about the threat she demands, willingly marching into the jaws of the beast. The hardest cage to break is always the one you lock your whole self inside, convinced you hold the only key. Let's pause the frame right here, because the camera captures something incredible. Watch this untouchable mastermind confess his fatal flaw. The rival boss, Duca, has discovered that Matteo's true weakness isn't his sprawling territory or his wealth, it is Julia. And the most tragic part of this scene, Matteo looks her dead in the eyes and completely agrees. He strips away the bravado. He delivers the cold, terrifying reality that he would gladly burn his entire criminal empire to ash just to keep her lungs drawing air. It is a deeply twisted devotion, yet it strikes a heavy chord in the chest. Here stands a ruthless ruler who solves every problem with lead and blood, rendered entirely tire-paralyzed by his love for a woman. The closing lesson is quiet but profound. The massive walls we build to keep the dangerous world out almost always end up trapping us as inside with our deepest, softest vulnerabilities. The camera pushes in on Julia, a lone figure anchored in the bitter frost of the garden. Months ago, she fled this exact estate, swearing she would never let the monster touch her again. Now, the moonlight catches the sharp exhale of her breath as she stares up into the pitch-black winter sky, her certainty turning to ash. You can see the exact frame where the trauma bond hooks its claws into her mind, terrifying in its silence. Her hands tremble against her heavy coat. Terrified of her own surrender, she bolts for the safety of the house, like any of us would. Matteo remains in the freezing dark, watching her go, promising a war for tomorrow. It brings us to a harsh, inescapable truth. The most terrifying thing is not the monster waiting in the dark. It is the sudden realization that you want the monster to catch you. Let us hold on this frame for a second and take in the agonizing irony of the moment. Julia lingers on the heavy oak threshold, her voice barely a whisper as she thanks him for putting their unborn child first, desperately feeling the magnetic pull between them. As she steps back into the very cage she risked her life to shatter, Matteo stays rooted in the frost. The harsh amber porch light catches that faded loyalty above all ink on his neck. For 2 decades, that tattoo meant bleeding for the syndicate. Now you can see his entire worldview fracturing behind his dark eyes. He is the shield guarding her from the wolves, but he is still the warden holding the heavy iron keys. The lesson here cuts deep. True loyalty is not about bleeding for someone. It is having the agonizing strength to let them walk away when staying will break them. Cut to 3 in the morning. The bedroom is swallowed in suffocating shadows. The fragile illusion of peace Julia built for herself shatters instantly as she wakes to the chaotic, rapid-fire snap of Italian drifting up from the freezing courtyard. This is not a simple late-night dispute. Her eyes dart the wind as her mind recognizes the clinical, terrifying rhythm of syndicate soldiers moving to plug a security breach. She curls inward, her trembling fingers instinctively protecting her stomach, paralyzed by the horrific fact that the war has literally bled onto her doorstep. The camera lingers on her wide, terrified eyes, teaching us an unforgiving reality. You simply cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you, no matter how thick the stone walls are or how many armed guards patrol the gates. You and I have to look closely at what she snaps because takes over. There is no thought, just pure visceral trauma responses driving her forward. She pulls a heavy wool robe over her shoulders and towards the window, hiding in the velvet shadow like a ghost. Below, the courtyard is drowning in chaos. A guard frantically flashes a grainy photograph, while a sweating lieutenant delivers catastrophic news. After merely 30 seconds of watching the disaster unfold, Julia disks every boundary she fought to build and marches directly down to the ground floor study. Her bare feet make no sound on the marble. It reveals a brutal truth about survival. Fear might teach us the rules of the game, but when your sheer existence is threatened, you will shatter every single rule without a second thought. The camera sweeps slowly into the dim study, finding Matteo bathed in the harsh, sterile glow of the desk lamps. His jacket is thrown aside, sleeves pushed up to reveal heavy, dark ink mapping his forearms. The old, arrogant mob boss would have instantly ordered her back upstairs to play the sheltered, obedient wife. But tonight, he does not utter a single word about her standing there. She's sane approach, letting her approach the mahogany desk to stare at the scattered, grainy surveillance photos. It is her old apartment lobby in Turin. A syndicate operative was inside her supposedly safe building. He is not shielding her from the terror anymore. It reminds us of a terrifying truth. True power is not about micromanaging a life. It is about stepping back and letting the brutal world convince them that they desperately need you. The lighting shifts, casting long, hollow shadows across the face of Julia as her stomach completely drops. The voice of Matteo is unnervingly calm as he reveals those photos were a mere 4 hours after she fled. Then, her eyes lock onto a blurred figure standing near the elevator in the printouts. It is her best friend, Serena. The raw, suffocating panic spikes in her chest, her breathing going shallow. But Matteo steps in smoothly, extinguishing the terror with a single sentence. He casually notes his men have already grabbed Serena and are heavily escorting her to the estate. He anticipated the strike and positioned himself as her absolute savior. It leaves us with a heavy, inescapable reality. The most dangerous predators do not drag you kicking into a cage. They make the outside world so deadly you lock the door yourself. Let us look at the beautifully twisted psychology playing out here. Matteo leans his weight onto the desk, the golden lamplight catching the rippling muscle and ink of his forearm. He explains the horrific situation with the terrifying calm of a man ordering his morning coffee. Duca wanted a pressure point, he murmurs, and out in Turin, she was totally exposed. But inside these walls, she is guarded by 30 men who would catch a bullet before letting a stranger touch the heavy oak doors. It sounds flawlessly logical, does it not? Yet, beneath the calm idiom, it is a masterclass in psychological isolation, quietly severing her from the entire outside world. It teaches us a grim lesson about deception. True manipulation rarely holds a knife to your throat. It usually comes offering a heavily guarded fortress to keep you safe. He attempted to play his ultimate card, his voice dropping an oct as he reminds her she is his wife, carrying his heir. He pins her with that intense, soul-piercing gaze designed to make her completely unravel. But the camera holds on Julia. She visibly straightens her spine, steps back from his orbit, and demands the actual tactical plan. She is actively fighting the bond in real time, and it is stunning. Astonishingly, Matteo actually pivots. For the first time, the arrogant kingpin drops his condescending armor and speaks to her like a true equal, mapping out how Duca is his northern territory. It is a bitter, tragic pill to swallow, but it is true. Genuine growth demands we drop off, but for a seasoned mastermind, even brutal honesty is just another carefully calculated weapon. Now the lens focuses tight on the tragic rot at the core of the syndicate life. The jaw of Matteo visibly clenches as he confesses that he used to handle these blood turf wars by tossing away small scraps of territory. But criminal greed has absolutely no ceiling. Duke wants the entire northern network, and when Matteo refused, Duke aimed directly at Giulia. You can see the pure video hatred of himself in his eyes as he admits his biggest failure. He is finally forming an alliance with 3 rival families, a move he delayed simply because his massive, suffocating ego could not stomach asking for help. It hits the audience like a physical blow. When the stakes are life and death, an inflated ego is nothing but a fatal vulnerability. You get to protect your precious, fragile pride, or you get to protect your life. You and I have to admire Giulia in this exact moment, because she does not miss a beat. She stares dead into the eyes of this terrifying syndicate boss, and plainly states that his ridiculous pride almost got her murdered. A typical narcissist would explode into a rage, but Matteo just takes the heavy hit. He offers a cold, deadpan nod, essentially admitting he is testing out a completely new psychological strategy. For a fraction of a second, they share this tiny ghost of a smile over how deeply fractured their reality is. She glances down at his heavily tattooed knuckles, her voice softening as she asks what her role is now. He simply tells her to stay safe while he handles the blood. It teaches us something profound. A deeply flawed person can tell you the honest truth, provided that truth perfectly serves their ultimate endgame. The mental gymnastics in this scene are absolutely staggering. Matteo outlines his newly evolved control system. In the past, he would have locked her in a gilded room to maintain his suffocating dominance. Now, he packages it as a highly pragmatic division of labor. He manages the sociopathic violence outside, while she manages keeping their unborn baby safe inside. He promises it is not about control. It is merely logical resource management. But Giulia is sharp enough to see the cracks. It is the exact same primal, obsessive possession, just dressed up in a tailored suit. To his credit, the silent gaze of Matteo agrees with her. She almost reaches out to touch his jawline, pulling her trembling hand back at the absolute last second. It leaves us with a heartbreaking lesson. No matter how much Goldgate you paint on the bars, an upgraded cage is still a cage. Instead of surrendering to a classic, sweeping, romantic climax, Giulia actively shuts the emotional valve. Her voice is ice as she tells the feared mob boss to get some sleep so he can actually be tactically useful. Matteo remains frozen behind the desk, his impenetrable Mafia armor completely stripped away. She turns and walks out, leaving him to drown in his bruised ego and the crushing heavy weight of his crumbling empire. By morning, the heavy doors swing open, and Serena is marched inside, radiating the pure, unadulterated fury of a civilian dragged into a bloody syndicate war. Over their tense breakfast, Giulia finally breaks her silence, laying bare the brutal reality of the syndicate world. It brings us to our final lessons. Keeping secrets is what keeps a toxic dynamic breathing. The second you drag the ugly truth into the sunlight, the dangerous illusion dies. Let us pause the frame right here and really look at this together. Serena stands in the center of the sprawling Mafia estate, the heavy marble columns looming around them like prison bars. She takes one look at this opulent cage and instantly names the pauses in the air. Giulia is still hopelessly tethered to the kingpin. Giulia lowers her head, confessing to the indivisible pull that silences her own survival instincts. Serena speaks a quiet, devastating truth. Think that human attachment survives without a single drop of logic. Julia tries to build a defense, whispering about the wreckage Matteo caused. She finally understands his careless neglect carved the same deep scars as his violence. But Serena delivers the fatal question. Has this man truly changed his soul? The lesson here is absolute. Excusing the one who breaks you is the first chain of captivity. We cling to the phantom of who they could be, blinding ourselves to the reality standing in the room. The camera slowly pushes in on Julia as she sits in the overwhelming silence of the room. She weighs the fractured evidence in her mind, replaying the exact moment the syndicate boss lowered his impenetrable guard. A tragic hope flickers in her chest. She almost believes the monster has been tamed. But then, her trembling hand drifts down to rest against her stomach. She feels the delicate flutter of the unborn child, and her darkest terror spills into the open. She is paralyzed by the fear that his gentle act is nothing but a temporary mask. Matteo is entirely boxed in by heavily armed rivals and her swelling pregnancy. He is playing the vulnerability card only because his usual violence cannot win this particular war. Serena forces her to look at the unvarnished truth. The lesson is written in blood. A temporary surrender is never a permanent cure. Real transformation does not occur when a predator is cornered. True change only happens when they hold absolute power and still choose mercy. Julia stares into the distance, completely stripped of any defense. Building a foundation of trust from the ashes of betrayal requires time they do not possess. 3 days into her captivity at the compound, Matteo summons a massive syndicate council. Watch Julia closely in this sequence. She stands her ground while drawing a brilliant, unbreakable line in the sand. She refuses to set foot inside that suffocating room. She understands that observing a venomous world from the outside is infinitely better than letting it drag you under. For 4 agonizing hours, the camera holds on her as she listens to the muffled, guttural roars of violent men echoing through the thick oak doors. When the silence finally falls, Matteo seeks her out. He collapses into the chair across from her, completely stripping away his armor. He leans forward, his tattooed arms resting heavily on his knees, staring at the floor like a broken man. This reveals a profound truth. Setting a boundary is not about taming a chaotic force. It is simply about building an iron fortress to protect your own fragile peace. The lighting in the room is stark and unforgiving as Matteo confesses the brutal ultimatum he's just delivered. Duca must accept the suffocating borders he despises, or the combined weight of the Mafia coalition will tear him to pieces. Julia studies his face and recognizes the bitter truth. Men poisoned by a god complex do not wish to die. They simply push their luck until reality shatters their teeth. Duca hunting Julia down was nothing more than the pathetic thrashing of a collapsing ego. But she also knows that a desperate, cornered man is capable of unimaginable horrors. Matteo nods, his eyes dark with the same terrifying realization. He confirms that 30 heavily armed enforcers will surround the estate until the blood treaty is signed. She remains absolutely still, tracing the edge of her book as she fights to stay anchored to the earth. Here is the tragic lesson we must face. Genuine safety is never found by trusting the promises of a cornered predator. It is only secured when you alone hold the heavy iron key to their cage. Let us look at this frame by frame, shall we? When Julia finally gathers the courage to say she must return to Turin, the Kingpin does not flinch. He simply stares into her eyes and softly whispers, "I know." Notice how the room goes entirely silent. He lowers his register, engineering his tone to sound as if her departure is tearing his heart in two. He promises he will not force her to stay. It is a terrifying performance. He disguises a sovereign command as a painful sacrifice, painting his former tyranny as an act of protection. The lesson here is harsh. You must never confuse a cat loosening the leash with the gift of actual freedom. The deepest tragedy of a hostage is that eventually the heart begs to believe the warden is a savior. A sickening certainty settles like lead in her stomach. Then he springs the velvet trap. He asks, so very softly, if she might consider moving to Milan when the child is born. Not in his fortress, but just close enough. He wraps this quiet request in a cloak of calculated vulnerability, making it an absolute horror to witness. He offers her a beautiful apartment in the city, carefully constructing the perfect illusion of independence. Then, like a seasoned actor, he lets his voice crack on cue. He whispers that he merely wants to be near enough to witness the small moments. When she asks for clarity, he plays his hand with devastating precision. He averts his eyes. The camera catches the dark ink on his throat shifting as he swallows hard. He reminds us that he has already lost 6 months of the pregnancy, laying in the crushing weight of guilt directly on her shoulders. This reveals a tragic aspect of human nature. The most inescapable cages are the ones we willingly lock ourselves inside. The suffocating silence stretches between them, heavy with her surrender. "I will think about it," she murmurs. It is the exact phrase she spoke at the divorce office, and we can almost hear the cold iron snapping right back onto her wrist. The bleak morning light washes over the estate in cool, desolate tones. Morning rituals are often the only thing keeping trauma survivors tethered to sanity. She paces the winding gravel paths, letting the brutal, biting November wind shock her fragile system and clear the suffocating fog from her mind. Sometimes, life dictates that our clearest revelations only surface when we step out into the freezing, uncomfortable truth. Suddenly, his massive frame fills the doorway. He has discarded his heavy jacket, allowing the pale light to trace the violent history tattooed across his arms. It is a primal, undeniable exhibition of sheer physical dominance. "It is finished," he announces to the freezing air. He does not wear a single trace of relief, because a king of the underworld never permits himself to appear frightened. Yet his rigid shoulders finally lower a fraction of an inch. Julia instantly deflects the terrifying weight of the moment, asking about Serena. He replies with chilling casualness that her friend is completely free to go. A fragile, involuntary laugh lips past her trembling lips. It is a sudden emotional fracture, a momentary loss of control that stuns them both in the freezing air. The camera lingers as he stares at her, his expression entirely stripped of its lethal edge. For one heartbeat, he wears the same devastatingly tender look he carried on their wedding day. It is a deeply human slip, a crack in the armor before his cold, impenetrable Mafia defenses violently snap back into place. She instantly swallows the bitter laugh, dropping her gaze to the gray, crunching gravel beneath her boots. "I am going to go home soon," she whispers, desperately gripping her final crumbling shield. It forces us to confront a quiet reality. True boundaries must be forged from solid steel within your soul before they cross your lips. "I know," replies, his voice like dark velvet. She looks up, her breath catching as she realizes he has silently erased the physical distance. He towers in her space, pulling a dominant move that makes the world vanish. The dark ink on his throat rests mere inches from her eyes. It is a silent Sushan suffocating monument to his absolute dominion. "I have something to say," he murmurs, his tone effortlessly seizing total control of the scene. He asks her to listen, begging her not to to build a defensive fortress in her mind. Watch how flawlessly this predator dismantles her psychological armor, piece by piece. Here is a vital life lesson we must carry with us. Anyone who demands that you silence your critical thoughts is quietly preparing to pull your strings. She completely freezes, locked in the tragic stillness of hunted prey, and weakly tells him she is listening. He draws a long, heavy breath. The camera focuses on his twitching fingers, betraying his violent urge to reach out and pull her against him. When I stood at that window, he begins, I want to be honest, Ernest. Everything went dead quiet. Yes, he perfectly describes the chilling, absolute detachment of a monster calmly preparing to burn the entire world down to ashes. You and I must pay very close attention to this next sequence. We are bearing witness to a tragic masterclass in how a shattered, immortal soul justifies his own ruin. He stares directly into her frightened eyes and declares that he finally recognizes his ultimate failure. He claims his mistake was not letting her walk away, but creating a world where leaving him was the only logical choice. It is a breathtaking, terrifying illusion of genuine accountability. He paints himself as the tormented king of a violent empire who only wished to keep his queen safe upon the throne. He admits that standing too close to a raging fire still leaves you horribly burned. He insists he is no longer the ruthless dictator who tore her life apart. But we know a dark truth. A deeply fractured man will endlessly rewrite history to cast himself as the tragic hero. The lesson here is written in tears. A poetic apology that is not backed by permanent, absolute behavioral change is merely a fresh coat of paint on a very old cage. I know I have to earn your trust back, he whispers to the cold air. Notice how he perfectly times every single pause, making his performance feel agonizingly raw. His jaw tightens in the harsh light, masterfully simulating a broken man fighting an internal war. He tells her she might ultimately decide he is not worth the pain, and he will silently accept his punishment. He is handing her the illusion of total supreme. For a woman and utterly starved of her own free will, it is the most intoxicating poison imaginable. He promised to be a father in whatever fractured arrangement she can endure. Then he locks his dark eyes with hers and delivers the fatal, tear-jerking blow. You are not just a room in my house, he rasps, his voice breaking. You were the reason the house had any meaning at all. It shatters your heart until you remember the brutal reality. Being worshipped as a precious possession is never the same thing as being truly loved. The wind rattles the dead branches, and in that freezing silence, her trauma bond completely locks back into place. Let us pause the camera right here and look at the ruin they made. We have Julia in harsh lighting, staring down a man built for violence. He is an apex predator, heavy with ink, a man who tore her reality down to the studs. Now he stands in the ash, genuinely confused by the collapse. She strips away every defense and plainly states the agony he caused. It was never one mistake, but a suffocating grip he mistook for devotion. He shifts his heavy shoulders, repeating that he knows, but she wants the raw truth. Finally, as this untouchable king drops his hands and whispers his own terrorisms, the lesson to remember is clear. True affection does not require randomness, and it should never feel like a hostage situation. Notice the bitter irony flooding the frame. The most feared man in the city stands entirely exposed, confessing a fear he has swallowed for 20 years. He is handing her the blade to his own throat simply because she demanded something real. When she presses him on his terror, the camera lingers on his fractured expression. His answer is agonizing. He is terrified he will ruin her again. He knows his mind is wired to manage, to control, rather than to trust. She holds his gaze, seeing the permanent fractures in his soul. It is a devastating image, a classic tragedy unfolding in real time. The hard truth we all face is that knowing your darkest flaws without doing work to fix them is simply booking the time and place for your next disaster. She offers him a fragile sliver of grace, acknowledging his self-awareness. He quietly nods, knowing awareness is a shadow, not a cure. But the universe has a cruel sense of timing. Deep inside her, the baby rolls. It is a primal reaction to the low, rumbling bass of his father. Without thinking, she breathes out that the child moves whenever he speaks. That single sentence is a fatal blow. The untouchable kingpin freezes dead in his tracks. Decades of violent, hardened armor melt into the freezing air. The camera catches his eyes dropping to her stomach, utterly broken by a truth he cannot fight. The lesson here is quiet but heavy. Your body will always betray your mind, speaking the brutal truth long after you have built a perfect fortress of lies. Watching a man who commands life and death suddenly beg for permission is a haunting piece of cinema. He breathes a question he cannot even finish. She sees the raw panic in his eyes and guides his hand. Think about the stark contrast in this shot, those violent, scarred knuckles resting gently against the very center of her life. They stand frozen in the winter light, and the baby kicks again. The overlord shuts his eyes, exhaling a ragged breath, completely paralyzed by something so small. He murmurs about the child being strong, blind to the dark irony of his own destructive power. The truth here is fundamental. Real strength has nothing to do with the damage you can inflict. It is found entirely in the restraint you show when holding absolute power. Step back with me and watch this beautiful, doomed moment unfold. He looks at her, stripped of all her armor, and he struggles for words. She begs him to stop, her own tired heart turning against her logic. He promises not to push, his chest heaving, but he drops the match anyway. He calls her the single most vital piece of his existence, a truth he choked down for 2 years. As the director of your own life, you want to scream at her to run. Instead, she overrides her own survival instinct, pressing her forehead against the chest of the monster who broke her. The hardest pill to swallow in this life is simple. You can feel deep sorrow for the one who broke you, but letting that empathy override your own survival is a fatal error. Focus closely on the physical space between them. This is not some sweeping romantic embrace. The camera shows 2 exhausted humans leaning against each other because the weight of the world is too heavy. He is terrified to even hold her, standing as stiff as a soldier with a live grenade, stroking her spine exactly once. When she finally steps back, the cold armor slides right back over her eyes. She straightens her coat, declaring she is returning to Turin. He takes the brutal hit in silence. Yet, she leaves the door cracked back, whispering she might consider Milan. The cold reality of this scene. Genuine healing requires physical space. If you stay anchored to the exact source of your suffering, you will simply keep bleeding out until there is nothing left. You and I need to stop and look at this massive shift in the power dynamic. Matteo is playing a totally different game now. When his terrifying control tactics fail, he instantly changes his strategy. He offers to fund whatever she needs, perfectly dressing his desperation up as kindness. He is still moving the chess pieces, but now he does it with a soft voice. She wisely holds the line. She escapes to Turin, taking a quiet 4th-floor walk-up, just to hear her own thoughts again. It is a masterstroke of survival. The life lesson here is written in stone. Real peace will never be gift-wrapped by the person who locked you in a cage. You have to walk away and build your own quiet sanctuary with your bare hands. The scene opens on her packing up a temporary life, fueled by heavy wine and agonizing clarity. She hit 30 weeks, gets her medical clearance, and decides to play a wildly dangerous hand. She puts Matteo on a total blackout. The only scrap she feeds him is one picture of a sunlit nursery. It is a surgical strike. His reaction is a shattered reflection of his massive ego. He replies with a single curse. The man is completely unraveling because he cannot manage his own legacy. She stares at the glowing screen, sees the deep cracks in his iron facade, and quietly begins searching for an apartment in his territory. The reality here is deadly. Absolute silence is the sharpest knife you can wield against someone who demands total control. The camera pans across a beautiful flat in the Navigli district. High ceilings, worn vintage tiles, and pools of warm morning light. It is the visual opposite of his cold, fortified compound. When she drops the news that she's moving to Milan, you can see the panic flash across his face. He calculates the timing, realizing she waited until her 34th week, the final medical window for travel. His gangster reflex kicks in, ready to command his soldiers to move with her, but he catches himself, swallowing the order and offering it as a soft suggestion instead. Still, he asks to sweep the perimeter. She shuts him down instantly. The lesson is undeniable. When you are putting the pieces of your life back together, you must defend your new borders like a warrior. Now the tension reaches a boiling point. She casually corners him about Valentina, the woman lingering at the gate. Watch his body language shift into defense mode. He hesitates, crafting his response, admitting a past, but swearing he cut the ties. For a man with a god complex, admitting a mistake is massive, but her trauma has forged her into a human lie detector. She instantly links Valentina to the recent syndicate attacks. The dead silence over the phone line is cinematic perfection. He is entirely paralyzed that she connected the invisible dots. The hard truth to carry with you is this: you must never underestimate the terrifying, razor-sharp instincts of someone who had to study your toxic patterns every single day just to stay alive. She coldly reminds him of her roots. She is a bookkeeper's daughter, her mind built to track numbers and broken patterns. Cornered, Matteo finally spills the ugly reality. Valentina was the rat selling out his security schedules. He drops a chilling, deadpan line about Valentina no longer being an issue. Standard mob speak for a permanent grave. When Julia attacks him for the lies, he instinctively weaponizes his own guilt, blaming her for walking away. She snaps back, calling herself his former wife, but he slides the knife in, smoothly pointing out the divorce papers remain unsigned. The life lesson here cuts deep. Keeping dark secrets under the disguise of protecting someone is almost always a selfish lie used to guard your own comfort. Stick with me as we examine this final, brutal frame. She blinks, completely blindsided by his logic. Her lawyer filed an extension, meaning she secretly stalled the final blow. She whispers her confession. She has not signed them. The silence that drops between them is suffocating, heavy with the gravity of their tragic, magnetic codependency. The scene cuts to a freezing December morning. She is 32 weeks along, watching his silent, loyal soldiers carry her boxes into the new flat. They call her Sonora, eyes locked on the floor. The profound lesson hidden in this quiet snow globe is heartbreaking. Sometimes we stall our own great escape, leaving the back door wide open, just in case the monster we are fleeing magically transforms into a saint. Midday light spills across a soft gray rug, illuminating the white dresser and a baby mobile swaying in the quiet draft. His silent crew has vanished, leaving behind her new sanctuary. Let us look at this room together, you and I. This is not his guarded compound. This is a monument to her independence. The rush of true safety finally washes over her. Empowered, she texts an invitation for lunch. Within seconds, his reply flashes on the glass. He insists on bringing the food, a desperate attempt to disguise his obsessive control as gentle care. The tragedy is plain to see.
Taking total ownership of your own physical space is always the mandatory first step to ripping your soul back from the hands of the man who broke it.
The camera lingers on her chest, rising and falling, as she breathes in real, unfiltered air. 7 weeks until the baby comes, but the quiet shatters at noon. The heavy door swings open, framing the big bad wolf. His dark coat hangs loose, sleeves rolled down to hide the venomous ink scarring his neck. In his lethal hands, he carries takeout from a tiny spot she mentioned 18 months ago. Men obsessed with power never forget a detail if it buys them loyalty. He steps over the threshold, and in 3 silent seconds, his dark eyes scan the shadows, checking sightlines, mentally mapping every exit. It breaks your heart to watch. People rarely shed their deep, violent survival instincts. They simply change. The lighting of the rooms where they deploy them. The tension drains from his rigid shoulders once his paranoid mind confirms there are no killers waiting in the shadows. The most dangerous man in the city stops dead in front of the delicate white dresser. His lethal hands bury themselves deep in the pockets of his coat. "It is good," he whispers, the sound barely scraping the walls. "I know," she fires back, her chin lifting as she claims her newfound power. For a fraction of a second, the corner of his mouth twitches into a smile. They sit at her cheap table, eating absurdly expensive food. There's like trading baby names like rival warlords, carving up city blocks. We have to face this bitter truth. Real equality only breathes when 2 bruised people can finally sit across a table and absolutely no one holds the key to lock the door. The lighting shifts, casting long, harsh shadows hiss across his face. He watches her with that terrifying, unblinking focus usually reserved for dismantling rival bloodlines. He counters her baby names with his own, turning a hostage dynamic into a standoff. But as the plates are pushed aside, the air in the room turns to ice. It sounds like a heavy steel vault swinging shut. "I need to tell you something," she says, her voice trembling slightly. She confesses that her escape last January was not just a tactical retreat. It was far darker. This is the moment the tragedy truly sinks its teeth in. Running blindly into the night is a completely useless move, unless you finally turn around and face the absolute terror of why let you yourselves decay in the dark for so long. Stick with me here, because this is where the script demands a tear. The camera pushes it in close. She stares down at her trembling hands by confessing the sickest secret of their bond. She never just ran from his violent empire. She ran because the sheer weight of her love for a monster horrified her. How? Imagine the torture of adoring a ruthless king, knowing you are just a fading ghost in his massive shadow. She fled to see if her mind was still her own, and now, she says, holding his cold, predatory gaze, "I am choosing." Think about the heavy gravity of those words. The ultimate tragedy of the human heart, that love means absolutely nothing at all unless you can easily walk out the open door, and you choose to stay in the burning room anyway. The silence in that cramped kitchen becomes so dense it suffocates. Slowly, his massive, ink-stained hand slides across the scratch table and covers hers. The camera focuses on his fingers. It is not a trap. It is not the violent grip of a warlord claiming a prize. It is completely gentle. "Julia," he whispers, the syllables catching in his throat without a trace of a threat. "I know we cannot go back," she warns, drawing a line in the wet sand. "Neither
am I?
He replies. I want something new. She flips her hand over, pressing her bare palm against his scars, demanding the one thing he has never surrendered, absolute honesty. Here is the painful lesson. You can never rebuild a shattered life if you insist on using the exact same broken bricks. The lens captures the exact moment she dismantles his empire of fear. She lays out the new laws of their fragile universe. No making choices for her. No acting like a prison warden and dressing it up as romance. She orders him to sit quietly in a room with her, without trying to hack her mind. That will be the hardest one, he admits. His thumb traces her knuckles, a fading ghost of the possessive monster he was born to be. Then, the unbreakable kingpin shatters. Yes, to all of it, he says, his voice thick with defeat. I am not negotiating, I am agreeing. It is enough to make a stone weep. The hardest lesson is that when someone who holds absolute power finally drops their weapons, that is the only real proof of change. Everything else is just a patient trap. Let us pause and rewind the film for a second, you and I, and fade in on the bitter cold of early January. She had been free for a year, surviving on nothing but nerve. But the trauma fractures her body, and she goes into labor 2 weeks early. In a blind panic, she dials the monster. He arrives in exactly 11 minutes. The math of that drive from his estate is utterly impossible. He was out there in the freezing rain, circling her block like a starving shark, calling his erratic obsession a form of protection. It is terrifying, yet profoundly heartbreaking. We all have to learn this the hard way. Someone standing right outside your door does not mean you are safe. Sometimes the fiercely loyal guard dog is actually the hungry wolf waiting to strike. The moment she rips open that apartment door, the camera catches a ruthless killer completely losing his grip on reality. His heavy wool coat hangs open, sleeves shoved up to expose every violent vow inked into his skin. He tries to lock his jaw, but his dark eyes are blown wide with sheer panic. He does not bark a single command. He simply offers his steady arm, shifting from a man who forces her hand to a man begging her to choose him. The rest of that hospital night bleeds into a frantic blur of agony. She screams, caught between her crying best friend and the mob boss crushing her other hand. It strips the soul raw to realize the truth. Sometimes we only survive our darkest, most violent nightmares by desperately grabbing the hand of the devil himself. Under the harsh hospital glare, a violently controlling man usually fractures. He would threaten surgeons just to feel like a god again. But this kingpin breaks every rule of his own dark nature. He draws no weapons. He screams at no nurses. He stands frozen, rooted exactly where she ordered him to stay. When the blinding agony of labor tears down her final walls, he does not posture as Dilfa. He simply leans into the sweat on her forehead, whispering that she is the bravest soul he has ever witnessed. As the pale sun breaks the Wednesday horizon, the sun is on Fake's first breath. Lasting change never kicks the door down to announce itself. It sneaks up in the quiet, shocking choice to finally close your mouth and listen. The camera pushes in tight for the climax. The newborn lets out a sharp, furious cry that cuts through the sterile room. As the undisputed king of the underworld finally reaches out to take his son, his terrifying aura simply evaporates. He presses this fragile, screaming life directly against his chest, right over the brutal black ink that defines his bloody legacy. The armor falls to the floor. His face is stripped bare, wet with unshed tears. He whispers to the boy that he will do better, a desperate, bleeding promise made to the cold universe. It proves a beautifully tragic fact about our humanity. No matter how deeply twisted a soul becomes, the raw instinct to shield our own blood can literally rewrite our broken brains. granting us one final shot at redemption. She watches him from the hospital bed, her eyes narrowed with the paranoid stare of a soldier surviving a long war. She reads the violence tattooed on his skin, but even she can see this invisible glitch in his armor. 2 days later, they walk out into the cold air, but the mobster does not drive them to his heavily armed fortress. He steers the car to her tiny apartment. A warlord willingly abandoning his castle is the ultimate surrender. He brews her coffee, then stands silently against the wall. Staring at a fragile new life he is not quite allowed to touch. It is a cinematic gut punch that leaves you breathless. The only way to truthfully love a broken survivor is to sit quietly outside the massive stone walls they built to keep you away and simply wait for an invitation. The camera lingers as the unthinkable unfolds. This man of violence, forged in blood, offers to walk out the door. It is a flawless tactical retreat, surrendering the keys to her freedom. Yet at the moment she softly asks him to stay for dinner, his hardened mask shatters. He accepts instantly, quietly, desperate. They eat in a glass-brittle silence. Then comes the true twist, as she simply falls asleep. Her exhausted body no longer registers him as a predator. The shadows deepen as he drapes a blanket over her, watching her breathe before fading into the night. On the table sits a note trying to write their tragic history. You and I know the truth. Intimacy is never magic. It is built brick by agonizing brick. Found in those terrifying moments, we finally choose to stay. The morning light catches the note he left behind. He promises to wait. Over the following weeks, this brutal enforcer shows a terrifying restraint. He refuses to cross her threshold without a spoken invitation. Watch Julia's eyes dart toward him. Her traumatized eye races for the moment the monster breaks from his cage. But the snap never comes. Instead, she watches an apex predator slowly pull out his own fangs. The lies stop. The camera closes in on his scarred hands cradling their son with a devotion so delicate it draws tears from her eyes. It forces us to face a hard reality. You can never extract trust through fear or force. True loyalty is only ever earned by showing up day after day with nothing but empty hands. Observe the shift in his movements. He silently anticipates her needs, tirelessly done with barking orders. 6 weeks pass in this quiet purgatory before Julia reaches a massive emotional pivot. She dials Ferrante, the sweating lawyer from Act 1, telling him to halt the divorce. The camera holds on the lawyer as he freezes. He realizes the twisted truth. She is willingly choosing the fire. The power dynamic has completely inverted. She is no longer the captive. The iron keys rest solely in her palm. Ferrante sighs, feeding the documents into a stretcher like a man exhausted by endless mafia tragedies. The lesson here is profoundly clear. Forgiveness is never a magic spell to wash away the blood. It is merely the terrifying choice to drop your heavy armor and wait. She chooses a quiet Sunday to hand him the shredded legal papers. The strips away all music. There is only the baby's soft breathing and long shadows bleeding across the floor. As Matteo scans the ruined document, Julia raises her defenses, warning him not to think he has won. Then comes the shock. He actually agrees. He openly admits he is still on trial, that his violent hands have earned nothing. Watching a man built on ruthless ego swallow, his pride is staggering. She softly commands him to step closer. He stops just outside her reach, the harsh gang ink on his throat exposed under the bare kitchen bulbs. You see, true power is never about being untouchable. It is about staring directly at the monster who broke you and realizing the fear is completely gone. The camera pushes in tight as she reaches past the tailored suit and the prison ink. She presses her bare palm flat against his chest. Her gaze cut straight through him, laying down the final law. The bloody slate remains stained. She is simply choosing the broken man standing before her. Matteo traps her hand against his heart, the frantic hammering of his ribs practically vibrating off the screen. He swears on his soul to spend his life proving his rebirth. The kiss that follows is a masterclass in restraint. It is not the toxic, desperate collision from the first act. It is painfully slow, anchored by the crushing weight of genuine trust. The bitter truth is that healing never demands we pretend the monster was a myth. It simply means the monster has finally learned to bleed. Let us look at this piece by piece. The director draws strict invisible lines here. Julia retains absolute sovereignty. Her apartment is a fortress, and the ruthless crime boss is just a guest. Astonishingly, he accepts this surrender without flinching. A sudden wail from the baby monitor slices the heavy silence, but Matteo does not march into the nursery. He freezes. His massive frame stands completely still, waiting for Julia to grant a single nod of permission. Only then does this terrifying killer lift his son with bone-deep gentleness. The untouchable kingpin who once burned cities is now entirely at the mercy of a crying infant. It is a brilliant cinematic irony. The strongest, most unbreakable chains we will ever wear in this life are always the ones we willingly ask for. The frame isolates Julia against a massive window. She stares down at the frozen streets of Milan, a city entirely blind to the psychological warfare that just ended above it. Stick with me, because the subtext is magnificent. She is not trying to glue the shattered shards of a poisoned marriage back together. She is pouring thicker concrete for an entirely new fortress. Somehow, she has rewired the predatory instincts of a crime boss. She faces a terrifying new chapter with the ice-cold focus of a survivor who crawled out of the dark. As the camera pulls back, it leaves us with a vital truth. You cannot save a doomed house by slapping fresh paint over rotting timber. You survive by tearing it to the dirt and building new walls that know exactly how to take a hit. Let the final shot sink in. It is the ultimate cinematic punchline. Study the amber light bleeding into the nursery. A mob boss who spent decades making men tremble is now paralyzed by the fragile weight of a sleeping infant. Across the shadow stands Julia. Armed with nothing, she has completely rewired a megalomaniac's universe, his sacred Mafia code of loyalty. It has morphed into a beautiful, inescapable trap. The film closes on one last piercing truth. Real power is never measured by who you can destroy, but by who you finally surrender your heart to be. Thank you for stepping into the dark with me today. If this breakdown left a mark, hit subscribe and drop your theories below. Did you see his shift coming, or was the shadow too deep? I will see you in the next frame.